Hey there, everybody. Welcome to your MCAT channel class for the evening. There we go. My name is John Lennox. I'll be your host and tour guide through today's session. How are we doing today? What's going on, Fong? How are you doing? Oh, let me tilt that a little bit. There we go. Get that. There we go. That's what we're looking for. Hey, now I have a bunch of familiar names coming back as well. It is Nava, right? I know yesterday we corrected it. It wasn't Neva. It is Nava, right? I know I said this yesterday. Okay, I thought so. Just want to double check. Cool. Good to be back. Good to be back. So notice we've got Eli in the room as well. He is a rock star and already been chatting with a bunch of folks in the Q&A about very specific things going on with your actual scores. And so this is one thing that we really do want to kind of set the tone with all these exam reviews. First and foremost, you don't want to be here unless you've taken full length 3. So let's just get that out of the way right now. If anyone's in the room and has not yet completed this exam, you actually want to take off. Come back in exactly an hour, though. I'll be running through the structural organic chemistry, a lot of isomerism and stuff like that in a little bit, and so we can get really specific with all that stuff. But these are meant to be reviews. Couple things to talk about, though, before we get too deep into it is we're all a couple exams deep at this point. If you're reviewing full-length 3, you've taken at least 3 full-length exams at this point. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that you are reviewing the exams effectively. And so one thing that's really important that people tend to forget to do is that when you're going through and doing your exam review, you're not just looking at the exam, you're identifying the specific content areas you need to work on. So in the middle of your exam review, study it, and then do a couple additional practice problems on that same content. The idea is that you want to identify what your weaknesses are, work on them, and then practice them before you take the next full-length exam. And so since the MCAT's now like 7 hours long and reviews up to 15 or more hours to do, you really want to make sure that you're actually mixing all of that practice and those additional practice problems into the middle of your exam. Don't just spend 15 hours writing down what to study and then spend a bunch of time studying and practicing it. You want to work that in throughout the entire time. Exactly. And so, yeah, as you can see, Eli's got in the chat there, a bunch of folks are talking. So if it's taking a little bit, it's just because he's chatting with a bunch of folks. But don't worry, we'll make sure to get back to every single person's question. And, of course, if a bunch of people have the same question in Q&A, he'll just turn it over to me and we can talk about it to the whole group. Cool. All right, so with that stated, let's talk about these exam reviews in general. Remember, this is not meant to be a comprehensive review of the entire exam. It's just meant to be a review of a couple specific learning goals and opportunities that we can use the exam as a context to really talk about a couple of specific things. So we don't even necessarily go through all of it. We really want to identify a couple key points and then really zone in on those. So the ones that we identified for today was basically making sense of experimental design, but not completely understanding the entire experimental design, really just getting enough to get the points. It's really keeping in mind that there's so much in the test that could help, and yeah, the questions might refer to it, but you don't need to understand every little nitty-gritty detail to get the points. So we're going to focus on the points today and what you really got to focus on the most. We'll also talk about explicit results as well as reasonable implications. So not all conclusions are directly stated in the passage. We'll talk about how to identify the ones that are as well as the ones that aren't. After that, we'll get into some nitty-gritty knowledge. We'll talk about Piaget, talk about a couple different developmental things as well, and talk about how we can basically use that background to answer the questions. And actually, I think one of the cool things we do today is give you a couple really cool screenshots that summarize a couple major theories. So it's pretty fun. All right, so we'll do that as well as that's those 3. That's it. All right, so let us know if you have questions. As you guys know, Eli's running the Q&A. He's going to hang out in the chat as well. Let us know if you have any questions at all. And then, of course, we will do whatever we can to make sure you guys don't leave with questions unanswered. All right, so since we're going to be talking about experimental design, we might as well start off talking about the actual, real basics in terms of experiments. So we've got independent variable, dependent variable, population, and sample. These are 4 of your most common terms that you see, so we really need to break these down very well. So what the heck does independent variable mean? What would be a way to summarize the independent variable? There's one way to say it. It's super easy. Yeah, there we go. Exactly, Kaylin. You got it. And Emily, the manipulated variable, right? So the ones that we basically manipulate, the ones that we change. Let's think about how this traditionally looks on a graph. So would it be your x-axis or your y-axis, traditionally speaking? yeah, well, you're right. It is the x. I mean, you could do either. Like, it doesn't really matter how you graph things, but generally when we do a graph is we're changing the x to see how it affects the y. And so generally speaking, of course, nothing's ever true 100% of the time, and the MCAT can totally change things around if they want to, but you got it. So generally speaking, this would be the x variable, yeah. It's the thing that we change, exactly. Cool. So as we said, if you change the independent variable, then it's going to, of course, change the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the one, of course, that's actually measured. This does tend to be measured on the y-axis. Now, that doesn't work, as we said, 100% of the time, but majority, that's what we would expect in terms of relating that to graphs. No worries, Emily, no worries. And actually, that's one thing to talk about, too, since this is an exam review, I'm going to try to really tie it into as much we can, like the actual overall process of taking these exams. But has anyone else noticed those, like kind of like what Emily just did here, like the little silly mistakes? You're like, oh, I totally knew it, but I put down the wrong thing. Anyone find themselves doing that a lot on the actual exams, like your actual full-length exam? Way too much Bradford. Yeah, so, you know, the more you take exams, and once you guys get into your stride, so most of us aren't going to really hit our stride until we're on full-length like 7 or so, usually about 8 or so is what we recommend as the bare minimum. What you'll notice is that the frequency of those mistakes, like you start making less content mistakes because you're figuring out more of the content, but those silly mistakes tend to become predominant. And so it's really important to make sure that as you're going through all that, you got to keep track of what those silly mistakes are and where you're making them. And so have we all made Y message sheets at this point? I'm guessing. Yes, cool. All right. So at the end, I can give you a little Excel file document that kind of like shows you how to do it. So one thing that I do want to let you know, though, Tristan, because they take a really long time to make, especially at this point, if you're making mistakes because they're content gaps and content issues, and if you got something wrong because you didn't know it or you didn't know which formula to use, don't bother putting it in your Y I missed it sheet. What would you? So instead of really putting that stuff in your Y I missed it sheet, just open up the review notes, study it, and practice it. But if you're making silly mistakes, like if you're getting things wrong where you knew it was right but you still selected the wrong answer, or if you're misreading answer choices or question stems, that's the stuff you really want to put in there because that's the stuff that you need to identify what it is specifically that's going wrong. Like your SMART reports are going to break down the content and tell you what content you know and what content you need to work on, so you don't really need the double duty of Y message sheets as well as SMART reports. But man, those silly mistakes, only way you're going to know that you're making them is by keeping track, and that's what those things are really for. So if you have questions about them, hit us up. Eli can talk about them for days. We can give you, of course, an Excel file to work through it if you want. But that's real important. It really is. And that's what, of course, it was a good opportunity to bring that up, Emily. I appreciate it because, man, this class isn't just about talking about psych-soc. It's about really breaking down the exam process itself. All right, so move on to the next part of it. What about population? So population would be, does that have to mean all humans, like the entire population of the Earth? Population, everybody? What could it mean instead? Why don't you guys give me an example of a population? Because it doesn't have to be all humans. It could be humans in general. But what could you make your population instead? You could do Americans. That'd be an example of a population. You could also do, yeah, all people with some given disease, Emily. That's awesome. That's a great way to say it. It basically, you're looking for a subset of the population. It could be the entire population itself, but it's the set of characteristics that you're actually looking for. It could be with a disease, could be cultural backgrounds, could be that they're human, could be males, could be females, could be anything. But it's whatever individuals have this set of characteristics that you're looking for. And then the sample, of course, is what we're actually analyzing to get a measurement of the actual population. So it's basically, it's like the actual people they're measuring, all that is, but the idea is that you want to try to extend that as much as possible to the actual, population as a whole. And we cover this in your actual on-site class or online class as well, but this is the key to external validity. External validity is all about how applicable your sample size is to actually relate it to the population as a whole. And so remember, it could be just for one specific subset of the population with the disease or whatever it is you're looking for, but do be aware it's the relatability of the sample to population is all about external validity. What would be one way to increase the external validity, to help that you could actually match the sample to the population as a whole? There's one kind of easy way to increase your external validity. Yeah, you got it, Tristan. The easiest way is just increase your sample size. The larger the sample size is, the more representative it's going to be of the population as a whole, and so it's an easy way to kind of basically increase your external validity, make it more applicable to the rest of the population. Nice work. All right, so now in terms of structure today, we're going to spend the vast majority of today going through individual questions. We'll cite the passages when we need to, but we're not going to just go through passages to go through passages in terms of today's structure. All right, so first things first, let's look at, of course, oops, sorry, wrong button there. There's what I'm looking for. Let's read this question. So notice the actual question itself, and this happens pretty traditionally, is the very last sentence of the question stem. And so it's actually asking us for what of the following, of course, is your independent variable. And so we read the question stem to figure out whether it is, but we're investigating whether cultural influences communication. A psychologist paired U.S. citizens with either U.S. citizens or a foreign visitor. And so basically we're trying to then figure out whether they're going to be happy or sad message to convey the meaning to the partner. Which of the following is the independent variable? So once again, independent variable, is this what's being measured or is this what we're changing or manipulating? Yeah, changing, exactly. And so, you know what? We don't even really need to look back to the passage to figure this one out. Just by looking at the question stem, what do we seem to be actually manipulating? What are we actually changing here? Yeah, Tristan, who they speak with. You don't even have to go back to the passage, right? And so looking here, we're looking for, of course, they're going to either pair them with speaking with a U.S. citizen or with a foreign national. And of course, if this is the thing that we're manipulating, that means the thing that we're manipulating, of course, is the independent variable itself. So it's who they're asked to speak with. And which of the answer choices seems to match that as quickly as possible or as easily as possible? Yeah, exactly. You guys are right. So, of course, the communication partner's pairing. It's just basically whether paired with U.S. citizen or, of course, another or foreign visitor. Cool. How about this? What would the dependent variable here be? So we already answered this. What's the dependent variable? Nice. Yeah, you got it, of course. The happy or sad, the reaction. Which answer choice looks closest to that? To the actually dependent variable? So we already said the partner. Yeah, Emily, nice work, of course. It is the type of message. So whether, of course, they're going to use a happy message or a sad message, that's the type of message that we're actually measuring, right? That's going to be the dependent variable. So you can then, of course, label B as dependent variable, D as the independent variable. So just a little breakdown, of course, of how this stuff works. All right, let's do the next one. We'll keep going through all these. Yeah, I agree. As Eli says, we're just warming up for now. All right, so this one we got a sociologist interested in. You know, the thing is, we see little things like this that seem like they're not a big deal, but that's such a big hint. They're interested in whether, all right, here's the goal of the experiment. Individuals' education levels affect their perception of a teacher who identifies as homosexual. So right there is the goal. How does education levels affect, of course, your perception of the teacher who's homosexual? Then it says, which of the following is the best study modification to test his theory? All right, so now this one, wait a second. What are we going to want to go back to here? Just to be safe. We're talking about education levels, how, of course, it's going to test his theory. Yeah, we got to figure out the theory itself, Tristan. Exactly true. So we are analyzing, of course, the individual's education levels. We want to figure out how we can actually, manipulate this, experiment itself. And so if we're going to modify the experiment, we got to know what happened in the experiment. So looking back to the passage, the experiment says you've got 93 female, 59 male undergrads participate, split into 4 groups, and then we basically have, of course, the 4 different lecture categories, right? Perfect, the different types of teachers. And then they're asked to basically rate their performance and their learning experience. So now, this is a common thing you will see in Psych Soc, is where they have a study or an experiment where there's actually some kind of a problem, and they make you identify the problem. So this alone, we can identify what the problem is. What's the issue? What's the problem? Think about the goal of the experiment theory, what they're doing, they study the structure of the experiment itself. There's a major issue this person or this experimenter has. What's true of all of their subjects? Every single one of them. Every single one of them's an undergrad. They're all college students, exactly true. Now, I agree that different college students, of course, are going to have different education levels. It's true. But in terms of, if you want to do a study to actually see how education levels affect perception, you better have education levels across the board, not just the subset within the undergrad community itself. Exactly. Stereotyping of undergrad, Tristan. Exactly true. And so that's the problem. Of course, arguably you could say there's different educational levels within one undergrad college even, but if you really want to apply this to the whole population, which in this case, how education levels in general affect it, you got to have people who have never been to college, people with PhDs, people who are undergrads. You got to look across the board. And which of these answers seems to match that pretty perfectly? Yeah, exactly, Tristan. A spot-on match. Basically, the closest thing we have, different backgrounds, just the surrounding community, right? Notice if you look at the other answer choices, we call into two major problems. Once again, we're still focusing on students at that same college. Once again, that same college alumni connections. We're focusing on just college-educated people. You got to get people who have either been to college or not been to college and have higher or lower different levels of education. Cool. Yeah, and then of course, you never want, well, I mean, you can, but not ideal to compensate participants with a cash reward to incentivize more participants. That's not going to make it a better study whatsoever. You got to make sure, of course, that you're just getting more variety, right? I mean, it'd be sweet for the participants, right, Tristan, but not necessarily good for the actual study itself. All right. We really kind of get into that stuff too. If you guys haven't yet been to the Psych Social Review for full length 2, we get really into the different types of ethical concerns when it comes to experiments and like justice, beneficence, and all that kind of stuff. And so if you haven't been to that one yet, I recommend checking it out because we get really into like how actually cash rewards can actually hurt the ethical standpoints of a study in that class. So check it out if you haven't been to it yet. And since you're all doing full length 3, I imagine you've taken full length 2 at this point. All right. So with that out of the way, there's our little bit of a warm up. Let's move on towards some twin studies, because have you guys noticed this actually happen frequently yet in just passages in general where there's some kind of a twin study going on? Oh my, this is like one of those things that happens, as Emily says, all the freaking time. So really, really common you'll see this. And so this is probably one of my favorite portions of this class, just among a couple others, but it's really breaking down the ways that you see this on the MCAT and, of course, what you want to be looking for. All right, so genetic versus environmental influences. For genetics, of course, this is, the nature versus nurture, the old school way of really like describing this stuff. Let's talk about the different types of twins. So what are your 2 types of twins? Broad category. This is also important for your biosciences. And also genetics also shows up in your bios kind of stuff too. Yeah, identical, otherwise known as monozygotic, exactly true. So identical versus fraternal. So know that, of course, the terms monozygotic, of course, means, well, how do you get a monozygotic twin? Let's kind of get more into the bio of this. How does it even happen? Excuse me, it's allergy season just started, so I might be sniffing a little bit. Yeah, you basically have one egg. Well, exactly. So like in the process of dividing at some point, right, basically it's going to split apart. But yeah, the egg splits, you get 2 different embryos from the exact same original cell, you could say. Dizygotic, how does that happen? And also this is, of course, approximation, right? We're just saying approximately 50 and 100. That's just giving you a general idea. It's not exact math by any means. Yeah, 2 different fertilizations. So you actually get 2 different eggs to come out, and so you actually get 2 different eggs, 2 different sperm, 2 different babies, which means dizygotic twins are actually just brother-sister or brother-brother or sister-sister. And so it's totally, same timeline, same age, all that kind of stuff, but otherwise totally genetically different. Other than, of course, they have the same mom and dad, so that's why it says 50% there, just because they are very related because they're siblings. It's just an approximation, though. All right, so after that we have environment. This is nurture, either raised together, same environment, versus raised apart, different environment. Now, does being raised together imply exact same nurture, exact same environment? They're raised together, same parents? No, there's actually a lot of variation that can happen even if children are raised in the same environment. Since, of course, minor actions, actually like things that happen in your life can have significant replications down the line. Especially the psychoanalyst would agree with that, right? But so because of that, like an individual day or experience can actually change it. We don't ever assume it's the exact same environment, even if they are raised together. Cool. Variance, of course, is just how spread out the data is going to be. So increased variance means, like less similarities. Decreased variance means more similarities. So then if we're going to combine these 2 things, dizygotic, monozygotic, and of course, environment raised together, raised apart, what would be the lowest variance? What would give you the lowest variance altogether? of these combination of 4 variables? You got it. So monozygotics and raised together in the same family exactly, whereas of course the exact opposite side of the spectrum would be I see, and you got it, of course. Dizygotic, of course, raised apart. So the lowest variance, as we would expect, would be raised together, and they're monozygotic, right? So genetically, they're basically the same. Then, of course, the furthest apart, we would expect, of course, dizygotic twins raised apart. Now, let's talk about this monozygotic twins raised apart. So this is a very common study that you will see both in just like the general literature and all that kind of stuff. Let's do some inferring. Let's assume that variance is low. So they're raised apart, monozygotic twins, the variance turns out to be low. What would that favor, nurture or nature? This is the kind of questions you get all the time in this stuff, so. Exactly, that favors nature, right? So if they're very similar, it shows even though they were raised apart, they still are very, very similar. Whereas, of course, if there's huge variance between the two, even though they're monozygotic, it's showing that environmental factors or nature, or sorry, nurture, you could say, played a very large difference. So now, when it comes to dizygotic twins raised together, it gets a little bit sloppy because no matter what, we know genetics already, accounted for being different. And then, as we said, since when you raise two twins together, it doesn't necessarily say that they have the same, environmental factors. So it really could be for either, whether there's low variance or high variance. It can either be environmental or genetic, or it could be environmental or genetic, because if you're dizygotic twins, your siblings, right, some siblings are actually really similar, which I'm sure you've seen with some of either your siblings or your friends, whereas some siblings are totally, totally different. So generically, they could be very similar or very different. And then additionally, depending on how they're raised or what the environment was or what happens in school, you can also get a lot of variance too. So it's messy, you would say. So dizygotic twins may raised together. It's hard to tell. Whereas the other categories we have here, we actually get a lot more information. We can tell a bit more about it. All right, so this is super common. If you want to screenshot this, I recommend it. There's going to be a couple different slides that I will recommend to screenshot because it's things that just show up a lot on the test. And so I'll try to hit all those major points and really just kind of focus on them. All right. Let us know if you have any questions. I know a bunch of folks are still blowing up Eli in the Q&A, but remember, the whole point of this is not just to go through and really, talk about the test, but it's really to kind of apply this to the rest of the structure in general. All right, let's go on to question number 39. As we said, we'll kind of do this piece by piece. All right, so this one says researchers were interested in conducting a follow-up study examining differences in environmental and genetic factors surrounding personality. Which of the following groups participants should be recruited? All right, so now the whole idea is we want to isolate as many variables as possible so we have just one thing that we're really looking at, right? And so we just want to find differences between environment and genetic factors. What should you definitely be true? Like what kinds of twins should you be using if you want to identify whether it's nurture or nature making the biggest difference? Definitely monozygotic twins, right? That way you can isolate the whole genetic variance. You've got the same DNA between two different organisms. You put them in different environments and then find out whether they're going to be similar or they're going to be different. So right off the bat, got to be, of course, our monozygotic twins. And as we said, of course, at the very top, if we want to see if whether the environment's going to be different or the same, the more different the environment is, the more data you're going to get. If they're raised together, it's harder to tell. Raised apart, you definitely know they have very different environments. So this is just a little application of the question that we saw on the previous slide. Cool. All right. Let us know if you have questions on any of the twin stuff because, as you know, twin studies are exceptionally common on the test, both in all of your homework stuff as well as the actual things too. All right. So here's a different one. This one did come from the passage itself. We'll have to look through the passage here, but because it says based on the study, so we're going to have to figure out what the study was. Which of the following best explains why information is collected on the aggressor's physical characteristics and level of intoxication? So there's no way we can answer this question without taking a step back to the question and figure out, of course, what we are looking for. So we want to find the control variables, identify the dependent variables, classification, motivation, of course, the independent variable as well. So let's look back to the passage real quick. A little reminder of how this thing worked. All right, so I guess first things first, what are we actually trying to analyze here? What are we looking for? What's the goal? What are we really looking at watching? What's it based on? Yeah, there we go, Emily. Motivation of aggressive acts, how the person's, the reaction. Most of this is reaction-based, right? What they're going to do exactly. Yeah, I like it, how aggressive traits, so we get into the traits too. That's another part of this. We get into a lot of it. But so the main thing is that for each incident recorded, information was collected on, right? The aggressive facial expressions, body language, all that stuff. Further data about the body, height, weight, level of intoxication, all that other stuff. So it says the aggressor's behaviors were later coded into one of 4 motive categories. So that's what we're actually, Emily kind of put that on right there. We have 4 different motivated categories that we're actually specifically observing. That's the key right there. And so it looks like we categorize aggressive incidents based on behaviors, based on motivation. You can see that as well. So then it says, of course, well, with any study, what matters more than anything else? Across the board, if you're going to read one thing about any study, there's two things. We already got one of them covered. Results, which is in table 1, we can see that in the next paragraph, which is pretty nice, as well as the goal. So we got the goal, we're basically categorizing how all of this, basically what the motivation was between these people. And of course, the results are in figure 1 right there. And also, when you start reading that second paragraph, there's a little phrase that pops up that should always grab your attention on the MCAT in general. Any idea what that little phrase is that should just stand out? There we go, Nava, exactly true. It's found. If you ever see it say, it was found that, slow down whatever you're doing, highlight it, read it carefully, be aware of it. It's most likely going to be the most important detail in the entire passage. That women were more likely to be motivated by compliance and grievance, whereas men, contrast, were likely motivated by social identity concerns and thrill-seeking behavior. So this is the key here. Not only were we talking about a motivation, which is the thing we are measuring, we're then cross-referencing it, of course, between women and men and seeing how it's different. And if we didn't pull that out of the passage, all you got to do is glance at the tables, and the table shows you what we're measuring. So notice your dependent variable, right? What we're actually measuring is the number of incidences, right? So like the number of times it happens. What we're, of course, manipulating, though, is whether it's either women or men, right? This is varying across the x-axis, as well as motivation, right, between that. Well, I guess we're actually analyzing the motivation. You know, we're starting to see whether men or women results in different types of motivations, and we're using the data to actually see which ones it's going to be. So, cool. Differences between men and women, and what the motivation is between them. All right, so right there, as we said, always look at your axes. And so there's our various variables of number of incidents, the motivation behind them, of course, and whether it's men or women that are being analyzed. All right. Notice height, weight, level of intoxication, facial stuff, all that was actually not included in the results. So we know it's neither dependent nor independent variable because it's not part of the data, right? So that's a huge hint. That's the kind of stuff we want to look out for, which is also why this kind of stuff in the actual table is the most important thing that we need for the test. All right. So why in the world were we collecting for the height, weight, physical characteristics, and all that stuff if we weren't actually analyzing them? Because we're really just looking at the motivation category and whether it's men or women. Yeah, Tristan, nice work. It's basically working as a control, right? We're trying to knock out things that won't affect the variables. Control variables, Reneke, exactly, that's what we call them. And so, of course, we can eliminate either the dependent variable or the independent variable. So I'd say B and looks like D were the two you can knock out first. And then, of course, those are the two to knock out. What about C? I mean, because that only really let us eliminate B and D. Yeah, exactly. It's not what we measured, right? So the actual physical features weren't what we were measuring here. We were basing it on behavior, right? We were only measuring behavior and, of course, how the motivation basically affected their behavior via men versus women. You got it, Tristan. Nice work. So it's really just control variables. Notice, though, that you could actually do that pretty quickly. Without even reading the passage carefully, you could look at the data, because as we said, results get tested more than anything else. Eliminate dependent and independent variable, and then at least choose between A and C if you're running short on time. Ideally, you'll take the extra time, read a little bit carefully, But it is important as you're going through the test to remember that if you can answer a question in 10 seconds from doing a quick scan, you want to remember that you can do that, because not only is it good practice in case you do run out of time, but it forces you to actually think about it really structurally and very critically as well. All right. Cool. All right, let us know if you have questions on that. Eli's blowing up the Q&A, so he'll snag anything left over. I think we're pretty good, though. Yeah, you know it. All right, so this one, I do have to say, I was pretty excited about this passage, mostly because, have you all actually heard the SHUs before? You guys heard this unit? Fans of sriracha out there? Oh yeah, you got it. Standard heat units. We're talking about spicy food all of a sudden. This is a pretty fun one. And so the cool thing is, a lot of hot sauces are actually using these now as their standard variables that they'll actually put on the hot sauce label, so you know like what the hotter hots are and the not as hot hots are. And so you can kind of like compare. If you actually look it up online, you can, if you Google any major pepper and go to Wikipedia, like habaneros and whatnot, it'll actually give you the base units and how we measure the heat across the different types of peppers. It's kind of fun. All right, so this question, though, specifically is talking about a very important concept for test day. Also something I'm sure you've noticed in a bunch of different practice tests at this point, Weber's Law. What the heck is Weber's Law? First step. Nice. J and D's, you got it, Emily. So just noticeable difference is proportional to the magnitude of the original stimulus, you could say. Amount necessary to trigger just noticeable difference is proportional. You got it. It's very much a percent would be a way to think of it, right? So if have you guys actually been to the sensation and perception class yet? I think Eli actually taught this one recently. Did you teach recently, Eli? I feel like you did recently. You did. I thought so. I had a hunch. So check out Eli's recording. It's on the archives. It's a lot of stuff in that class. It looks like most of you have actually seen it. So no, if you already have, don't worry about it. But this is a very important concept. It's in the very beginning of that class. Like the standard is, if you pick up a 9-pound weight and a 10-pound weight, you're like, yeah, they're totally different. Where if you pick up a 99-pound weight and a 100-pound weight, you really can't tell the difference, because notice, even though it's still 1 pound difference, it's a percent thing, right? So the first one, of course, is going to be 10% different. Next one's only 1% difference, depending on, of course, the directions you're going. Cool. So you got it. There we go. Eli's got the link for you even right there. So Weber's Law is basically doing that. You guys have already seen it, or you talked about it in the chat, so that's perfect. Larger difference in intensity is needed to distinguish more intense stimuli. Which of these gets really weird? There's a couple that get weird, but any ideas where Weber's Law tends to have problems? Kind of get weird? There's a couple, but there's one common one that you see actually break down. We actually talked about it in your, one of the exams kind of gets into this too. There's two actually, come to think of it. I'll see what you guys say. High and low or what? Oh, ends of the spectrum in general, you know? Or, yeah, that would make sense when it's the extremes. One thing I was thinking about is color perception's one that's a little bit wonky. You can't necessarily just change the frequency by like a given, like hertz in terms of the wavelength, and it doesn't really work quite the same. Color is very strange, especially because there's different ways that we perceive colors. And I don't know if you guys have actually, if you do you listen to what's it called? Oh, I can't remember. It's an NPR show. It's called Invisibilia. Have you guys heard of that? Seen that yet? I think I always listen to it when I'm driving. It happens to be on. If you are into podcasts, I recommend checking out Invisibilia. It actually has a bunch of really cool things that are very MCAT related in terms of perception, hearing, lots of different things are pretty neat. There's a whole one about color that's actually very interesting. It talks a lot about the new neuroscience of color and perception. It's kind of neat. But that also sounds weird because, of course, sound at different frequencies, the G&D actually changes. So as you basically change the frequency, the perception actually changes too. But yeah, light and sound are kind of funky when it comes to Weber's Law, but most things are pretty straightforward. They tend to be nice and easy. Cool. All right. So, yeah, yep. Oh man, that makes sense actually. It's because of the size of the ear canal. I didn't think of it that way beforehand, but that actually makes a lot of sense because you can only. Yeah, I won't get into it. If you hit up Eli in the Q&A, he can get way more into it. I don't want to start stipulating possible reasons why, but I like what you're thinking there. That's exactly. I was thinking you can get standing waves in there, totally. All right, but I won't get into standing waves. Hit up Eli if you want to geek out. So let's talk about this question. So we know that Weber's law says that the changing stimuli intensities need to distinguish more intense stimuli. In order to actually answer this, since we're looking at aspects of the experiment, let's look at the actual data. Now, before we even get too deep here, looking at the answer choices, what do you notice? There's an important thing to notice in these answer choices. I apologize. Allergies are kicking in before. Every single answer choice there's two different things that pop up a lot. Everything's about just noticeable difference, and as Tristan says, almost everything's dealing with 1500. So either greater than, less than, or equal to 1500 SHUs. So now, notice, if every single thing is dealing with that, we better look at the data and see why 1500 is actually pretty important. And as you can see when you glance at it, notice 1500 is the difference between participants in level 1 and difference in participants at level 2. So when their threshold sensitivity is 1000, do they notice the difference between the green, orange, and red hot sauces? Does it seem to be a significant difference between them? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the participant sensitivity heat threshold, it looks like when you have it down there, oops, excuse me. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Sorry, the tools look a little bit different today. It's kind of funky. Notice that if you look at the different data there, 16% say green, 17% orange, but then a big majority there actually says that the red is the hottest one. Gotcha. Notice the same thing goes on for the 2500. 22%, 28%, 50%, about twice as big, twice as many people are identifying, of course, that the red sauce is going to be the hottest. Whereas once you get up to the really, really high threshold here, it kind of breaks down. Like everyone's pretty close. There's not that big difference between the two. But we do have a significant difference between both of those. So if we know that they can notice the difference between the 1500 and 2500, would you expect the just noticeable difference to be greater than 1500 or less than 1500? Since we know there is a noticeable difference there between those two different trials. This is kind of getting into what the just noticeable difference actually means. So you think greater than, less than. Emily says less than. It's the Pac-Man, right? So you know. Tristan saying the same thing. I agree. It is in fact less than. So here's really the reason why, is that if you know that the difference between the 1,000, 25,000 is triggering this difference, it means that the just noticeable difference cannot be greater than that, right? And so it can't be greater than 1500, otherwise we wouldn't see the difference between those two different trials. Since we do see the difference between those two trials, we know at least that it's got to be less than that because it is showing a significant difference between the two of them. All right. If you don't like just noticeable difference, check out that sensation perception class. If you ever checked it out, it really spends a bunch of time getting into that and what it means in the different ways that we really see it on the MCAT. But as I'm sure you've seen, Weber's law is a pretty common one. It actually shows up a lot. So you got to be comfortable with that. All right, that's first bits. Let's jump into a couple other things. That was actually the majority of the class was kind of crammed in that first learning goal. The rest, we're going to give you a couple different more just big things to be aware of. And as I said, I'm also going to give you a couple screenshots of these things just to kind of save and put on your bathroom mirrors to memorize. And so, of course, conclusions come from one of two things. Either the explicit results, these are what are stated. As we said before, look for words that says, like, you know, it was found or the researchers discovered, all that kind of stuff is really your explicit hint. Or it could be given in the data, the figures, the charts, the graphs, whatever that might be. The inferred results are things that are not explicitly drawn by researchers, but that must be true, or they can be reasonably at least be inferred based on the experimental design and all the data that we have. And so it may or may not be directly related to the main point of the experiment as well. Do be aware of that. Often it will, but sometimes you can use the data to go even further beyond the scope of the experiment to make more conclusions. All right, so this also, of course, relates to cars. As you know, we'll be doing more cars later on tonight. Tammy, I believe, is going to be teaching cars this evening. And so if you want to really get into the whole, inferences and all that, that's, of course, I believe it's question types 2, gets really deep into those different concepts. Cool. Let me know, Sergey, if I was wrong about who's teaching. I think it's Tammy, but let me know if I'm wrong. Yeah, it was Tammy. It is cool. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. There we go. Exactly. It was Tammy. Spot on. All right. So let's do a little bit of this practice. All right, so it's based on the data, which of the following rules is likely to generate the highest rate of compliance in a group of 11-year-olds. Always difficult to do if you've ever worked with 11-year-olds. And so looking here, we've got a bunch of different things. So once again, well, what's the key in the question stem that lets us know what our first task is? There's actually a specific key in the question stem itself. Yeah, it's just a nice work. It says based on the data, right? So since it does say based on the data, we have to make sure that we're pulling our information from the data presented. If you ever see that, it's just as it says in Carr's passages. You know, if it says according to the passage, it's a detail. You got to go back to the passage. Same thing here. So let's flip back to the data and actually find it. And try to find what relates to compliance. If you look at them all, notice that we've got a couple different tasks. Breaking them down, it looks like A's pretty easy. They got to put their backpacks on their desks in order to leave. B looks kind of hard. They have to score perfectly. That's always difficult in any test. C says if they're caught chewing gum, they'll be held after class. It's easy to not chew gum. And then D says honor roll all year. That's even harder. So in terms of easy versus difficult, we know that definitely B and D are very hard. Also notice that notice the ones that are more challenging are also the ones that are reward-based, right? So if you basically score perfectly, you're given candy. If you're on honor roll, you get to go to an amusement park. Whereas the things that are easy, they're just kind of punishing the kids, right? Either cleaning up the classroom or not letting them go to lunch. All right, so let's actually look at the data and figure out what this specifically states. So it says we got a couple different trials here. You got studies 1 and 2 gave students a 10-question test of first grade math. Now, remember, these are 11-year-olds. So first grade math should probably be pretty easy. If you weren't sure of what grades relate to what ages, that's fine, because we'll notice later on it's talking about a 6th grade math test, which would definitely be harder. All right, so it says in study 1, they're giving candy, so reward. Study 2, it looks like they are not allowed playtime. Sad day for any 11-year-old that doesn't get to play. All right, studies 3 and 4 get a much harder quiz. So it looks like here we're getting a 6th grade math test. And then once again, study 3, they're given $20, which is a lot of money for an 11-year-old. At least it used to be. I don't know if that's true anymore, but it used to be a lot of money. And study 4, of course, are told that they have to sit silently. Sad time once again for them. All right, so let's look at the data. So right off the bat, what stands out? Yeah, exactly. I forget about inflation. Yeah, study 2, Tristan, Emily, exactly true. I agree with you guys. So study 2 seems to be by far and away the most efficient, has the highest success rate. It shows the most compliance among the students. So breaking these down, we said the top 2 were easy, the bottom 2 were, of course, difficult. And then if you rate down between 1 and 2, what was the big difference between 1 and 2? Because study 2 was the highest. So it was easy, and what was the other key? Yeah, exactly. It's punishment. Nice work, Ian. So, of course, we know that study 2 is using punishment for an easy system, and that has the highest compliance rate. So now, regardless of how it works in the real world with 11-year-olds, if the study says that you got to punish them and give them easy tasks to make them compliant, then that's what we need to look for in our answer choice. So which of these answer choices looks like it's easy and also shows that they are being punished? I like it. You got it. Answer choice A looks solid. So, of course, we can get rid of B and D. Those are the hard ones. We're left with A and C. What makes A better than C? Yeah, Tristan, that's the best way to say it. It's just more similar to the punishment described in the study. They're told to do something. If they do something, or if they do it, then of course they're not punished, right? Whereas if you look at C, you know, like getting caught chewing gum, it's not about like if we catch you doing this thing wrong. It's like just make them do the thing, right? Exactly. It just doesn't sound right. It's not really, it's not breaking rules. It's not an aspect of the study. As Tristan says, A is more similar to the study itself. You know, if they don't do this, then they're going to be punished. In this case, chewing gum is like if they don't not do this. They're adding an extra negative there. All right. Nice work. All right. Cool. So once again, we're sticking to that same passage, comparing the data across all 4 studies. What can be inferred about the confines of the experiment? So this is making us go a little bit beyond the task, right? So right off the bat, looking at the answers, it looks like it is a bunch of different words. We're inferring, of course, the data across. And so we already covered this, right? So the conclusion we reached about compliance is that, of course, easy tasks with the avoidable punishment gives you the highest compliance. And so which one looks closest to that? Easy task, punishment, highest compliance. You can get rid of definitely 2 answer choices right off the bat. What are the 2 we can get rid of right away? Why, Tristan? I don't like it. Oh, I got you. Yeah, I was going to say, I was like, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. So why'd you get rid of B and D? B and D's got reward. D's also got reward, which means you can knock out B and D right off the bat. Also, noticing between here, it says a less difficult task will invariably have a greater percent attempting its completion than a task of significantly higher difficulty. What is wrong with that word? It's too extreme, exactly. So it invariably means it will happen every single time. We don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case. That's too strong of a language. And as we said, of course, we know it's not reward-based. You can get rid of course, B and D as well. So we're left with only answer choice C left over. Nice work. I know we mostly do that in cars, but really, like something like invariably, always, that's the stuff that's really strong. And I know most is also strong, but if you compare the strength of most and invariably is exceptionally stronger than most. So do be aware of that. Sometimes your answers will have extremes. Just don't choose the one that's over the top extreme whenever possible. All right, let's go on to the next one here. Getting near the end of this passage. So if, hypothetical, right, found that instructors revealing their sexual orientation was effective in making the learning environment less hostile for homosexual students, which of the following strategies would also be most likely to be effective? All right, so here we find that revealing their own sexual orientation is effective at making the environment feel safe. I don't think so, Tristan. I don't think so. So we want to find something else that basically creates a less hostile environment. And to be totally honest, you could probably use outside information to really answer some of this question as well. The only thing we have from the question stem is that, of course, teachers revealing their own sexual orientation, of course, reduces the hostility of the environment. So let's just knock out the things we don't like. Let's talk about what we don't like here. There's a couple of things we can get rid of here. This is a fun logic game. Yeah, definitely not A. Policy prohibiting students from rating teachers based on that. It's not going to make it a more safe environment, right? It's just going to change the data. That doesn't really do anything. Definitely not A. Caitlin, why don't you like B? I agree with you. If you guys want to knock out a different one too, there's another answer choice that's too strong. But there's a problem with B as well. Yeah, Ian, you're right. I get rid of D. Mandatory school-wide workshop focused. Mandatory, too strong. Really way too strong there. Yeah, Caitlin, the whole idea too is we didn't say that by having homosexual lecturers is going to make it more safe. We just said by the lecturers revealing their sexual orientation, regardless if the lecturers are homosexual or not, right? So it doesn't really matter if you're hiring on more ones that do identify as being homosexual. You got to get rid of B. And so C is, of course, the one that would increase awareness. Just, you know, student groups promote awareness, provide support. It's very, very general, very open, very like less hostility. Well, that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. Nothing too specific, nothing too strong. All right, so let's go on to number 30 here. This is a fun one. For that, we'll give you a couple of screenshots. All right, so we survey 1,000 people, find that there is a positive correlation between wealth and happiness. So if we were to graph this, this might be kind of a fun way to do this. It basically means that as you are below the positivity level, you have an increased relationship between wealth and happiness. What would be the easiest way to graph this? What would you want your x-axis to be, wealth or happiness? What would be the logical way to graph this? Yeah, you got it. So you make your x-axis wealth, and of course, as you increase the wealth, the happiness starts to go up. Makes sense. There's your poverty line. So then after the poverty line, we don't really know what happens, but then what do we find out? What's the next piece of information? Then once you get to 100,000 pieces of dollars a year, we're guessing is what it stands for, probably not per day, it goes down. So we don't really know what goes on between poverty line and 100K, but we do know for sure that it goes down after 100K. So there's really only one thing that must be true according to the results. What's the one thing that must be true? And this is good to actually graph this stuff when you go through it, so I wanted to make a point to do this one. I like negative slope there, you're totally true. You got it. So people who live at the poverty level report higher satisfaction than people who live below it. We don't know anything about people above the poverty level except for, of course, people that are above 100K, so we can't make any definite conclusions about what happens beyond that point. All right, nice work. All right, so what we're going to do for pretty much the rest of the class, I want to give you guys a couple of super common things that do show up on the MCAT, namely some personality types, some stuff about cognitive dissonance will be another one, but mostly, as we said, I'll give you a couple screenshots of things to be aware of. Cognitive dissonance is super huge, and so, of course, the background of what this means is just some kind of inconsistency in how an individual acts and what they themselves believe. So basically, a person treats another person unfairly, even though they know it's wrong. So what are the two ways that we actually deal with cognitive dissonance, or dissipate the dissonance, or make us not feel bad about being mean to someone, even though we know it's wrong? This is high yield, so I'm just going to focus on the high yield stuff for the rest of this. Yeah, well, so yeah, I like it. Yeah, that's the most common one, is you just justify behavior somehow. So pretty much you'll have two main ways. Either you justify your action somehow, or you'll change your complete belief about it. So justifying would be like, well, they were mean, so they deserved it. Even though I was being mean to them, they were meaner, so they deserve it. Or you'll say, treating people is unfair because they deserve it. Exactly. And so this can be very, very problematic when it comes to a lot of different, like historical things that have happened in the past. And so people basically change their beliefs and think that certain people aren't as, aren't humans anymore, to be totally honest, because people are treating them very poorly. And so there's a lot of things that have happened, just through wars and things throughout the past couple of thousand years and issues like that. But so changing beliefs or just justifying your actions somehow. Two most common ways that people dissipate their cognitive dissonance. So then we can basically manipulate cognitive dissonance by offering rewards to various people. This is a classic example in one of your previous exams where, as we said before, by giving a significant cash reward, you can actually eliminate dissonance. Be like, well, yeah, I'll pretend this thing's true because I'm getting paid. And as long as you have some kind of excuse to justify, I'm getting paid to do it, it's not going to basically be as big of an issue or as large of a problem. So, all right. All right, so that's the first one. There's a couple more things I want you to be aware of. I'm going to kind of hit all the major points here for the rest of class. You got to know cognitive dissonance. If you want to go back to your test, this was question 51, basically talked about cognitive dissonance. You can check that one out. Instead, I want to get into a couple key things that I want you to screenshot because there's a couple really good summary pages in this class that I want you guys to have. But as we said, we cover a couple things in terms of basic content knowledge to get answers quickly. This is your first one, stages of development. I'm just going to open up this entire page so you guys can actually take a screenshot and then save it to your bathroom mirror. But I really like this infographic because it relates Erikson and Piaget into the exact same page. So do you guys all know how to screenshot? This is perfect thing for your bathroom mirror. It's probably my favorite part of this class is this infographic. Yes, right, Quaylen? Totally true. Oh my God, I saw this, I was like, yes, I'm saving this image. I'm going to put it on a bathroom mirror. There you go, yeah, so it's Command-Shift-4, gives you a little arrow thing. You can click and drag and take a picture of it. So check this out. Most thing is, remember, perfect Bradford, you want to change out your bathroom mirror about once a week too. So if you've already got lenses and mirrors, after a week, redo it with a whole bunch of new stuff. Important to do. All right, so remember it's the MCAT, so you just need to identify. You don't need to actually recall the stuff from scratch. So it's just like, okay, well, this relates to that. Just like know which ones are younger, which ones are older, and then kind of go from there. All right, so we do one question on this. This is a pretty quick one. So the children in this study, I'll give you guys a heads up, they were 4 years old. So they were 4 years old when they did this study. So according to Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, at the time they were entering the study, all the children would most likely, so they were between the ages of 1 and 4, basically. So by the time that they entered the study, basically, we're talking about little kids. Which of these would most likely already be learned in a little kid? You got it, A. What do you guys know what the mnemonic is for A, object permanence, what it really refers to? Yeah, exactly, Tristan. It's peekaboo. It's like, I'm there. I'm not there anymore. Oh my God. Like peekaboo is literally teaching them object permanence. That's what peekaboo is all about. And so that's, of course, the first of Piaget's stages. And of course, it is object permanence. So all the other ones go on after that. That's your first little information to know about that. The second infographic that I have for you, which is the other awesome thing I want you guys to keep, is the various theories of personality. I know, right? Eli still falls for peekaboo. I've seen him fall for it before. It's true. Is this guy right here. Notice all of the theories of personality summarized on the exact same page. And so once again, I want you guys to take a screenshot of this. It's just a really nice, concise breakdown of all the different perspectives that we have, the causative factors, and of course the examples of those causative factors. One thing that you might not know is ocean, so I can kind of type in what that stands for so you guys can have that as well. It's openness, conscientiousness, I'm a bad speller, I'm sorry, that's spelled terribly, extroversion, agreeableness, and then of course neuroticism. Everyone's favorite. So those are your, I'm going to split that up a little bit so you can see it a little more clearly. Yeah, it's right there. Now you can look it up in your books too. But there's the 5 different things that relates to ocean. Perfect. So know these major breakdowns. Know what they're mostly referring to. Honestly, this was I kind of think the last thing that really went was all those different infographics and things you need to be aware of. So as we said, if you haven't already covered your bathroom mirror, cover your bathroom mirror with all this stuff. Additionally, Psych Soc is really good for flashcards. So you guys got that flashcard app? Really check it out. Go through. I know a lot of this involves memorizing a whole bunch of terms, and so go for it. All right, so I hope you guys had fun today. There's a bunch of information. Hang out. I'm going to be running through the organic chemistry structural stuff in the next 4 minutes. So stick around. See you guys soon. In the meantime, take a short break and grab the recaps in the next slide.